Imagine for a moment that you are the most powerful person on the European continent, that millions of soldiers obey every one of your orders without question, that entire nations tremble at the sound of your name, that you have built an empire that extends from the coast of the Atlantic to the depths of the Russian steppe. Now imagine that all of that begins to crumble, that with every passing day, that empire shrinks a little bit more, that the armies which once marched victorious now retreat defeated, that the cities you built burn under the fire of enemy bombers, that your generals, those who swore absolute loyalty, begin to conspire behind your back, that your body, once erect and dominant, now trembles without control, that your mind, once calculating and cold, becomes lost in delusions of grandeur while the world around you collapses. This is the story of the last 365 days of Adolf Hitler. 365 days of desperate decisions, of unexpected betrayals, of lost battles, and of a fall as spectacular as it was inevitable. 365 days that changed the course of world history forever. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to give the video a good like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all parts of the world. What exactly happened during that final year? How did Hitler go from being the most feared dictator of Europe to a charred corpse in the courtyard of a chancellery in ruins? What decisions did he take that accelerated the destruction of his own regime? Who betrayed him in his final moments? And what secrets did he take with him to the grave? To truly understand how the Third Reich collapsed, we must go back to April of 1944. At that moment, the war had already taken a decisive turn. The Red Army advanced relentlessly from the east, recovering territories that the Nazis had conquered years before with such brutality. In Italy, the Allied forces had landed and were advancing toward the north, facing an increasingly weakened German resistance. And in the West, everyone knew it was a matter of time before the British and the Americans launched the invasion that had been so anticipated. Hitler knew it. His generals knew it. The German people, although constantly bombarded by the propaganda of the regime, also began to suspect it. But Adolf Hitler was not someone who accepted reality easily. His ascent to power had been built on the basis of defying the impossible, of converting defeats into victories, of manipulating perception until the lie became the truth. And in April of 1944, the Führer still believed he could reverse the course of the war. He still believed in his miracle weapons. He still trusted that the Allied coalition would fragment. He still thought that destiny had chosen him to guide Germany toward eternal glory. How wrong he was. The 20th of April of 1944 marked the 55th birthday of Adolf Hitler. That day, as was tradition, ceremonies were celebrated throughout Germany. The newsreels showed images of the Führer receiving congratulations from his closest collaborators at the Berghof, his retreat in the Bavarian Alps. The official photographs showed him smiling, sure of himself, projecting the image of a leader in full control of the situation. But behind that carefully constructed facade, the reality was very different. Those who knew Hitler closely noticed worrying changes. His posture, once upright and dominant, now showed a slight stoop. His left arm trembled occasionally without apparent reason. His eyes, which had once been described as hypnotic and penetrating, now seemed dull, bloodshot from the chronic insomnia that plagued him. His skin had a greyish tone, and those who visited him after long absences were shocked by his physical deterioration. What was happening to him? The doctors who attended him were not sure. Dr. Theodor Morell, his personal physician, treated him with a combination of substances that included amphetamines, barbiturates, glandular extracts, and a variety of injections whose exact composition remains a subject of debate among historians. Some modern researchers have suggested that Hitler could have suffered from Parkinson's disease, which would explain the progressive tremors, that became increasingly evident in his final months of life. Others have pointed out the side effects of the drugs that Morel administered to him daily, sometimes more than 20 injections in a single day. But regardless of the cause, Hitler's deterioration was undeniable. And what was most dangerous was that this physical deterioration was accompanied by an equally alarming mental deterioration. The Führer became increasingly paranoid, more distrustful of his own generals, more convinced that he was surrounded by traitors and incompetence. Any negative news from the front provoked explosions of rage that left his subordinates trembling with fear. The military conferences, which previously lasted hours and were characterized by detailed strategic discussions, now turned into endless monologues where Hitler rambled about past glories while ignoring present realities. In May of 1944, the situation on the Eastern Front continued to deteriorate. Soviet forces had expelled the Germans from Crimea after weeks of brutal combat. Tens of thousands of German and Romanian soldiers died or were captured. The troops that managed to evacuate did so in chaotic conditions, abandoning enormous quantities of military equipment. It was a crushing defeat that demonstrated clearly that the Wehrmacht could no longer hold its lines against the Soviet push. Hitler, however, refused to accept reality. In his military conferences, he blamed his generals for every setback. He accused experienced officers of cowardice, of defeatism, of deliberate sabotage. He ordered impossible counterattacks with units that existed only on paper. He prohibited any strategic retreat, condemning entire divisions to be surrounded and annihilated. His obsession with not ceding a single centimetre of territory, even when maintaining it was militarily absurd, cost innumerable German lives in those months. Why did Hitler behave in this manner? Was it simple stubbornness, military ignorance, or something deeper? Historians have debated this question for decades. Some argue that Hitler never truly understood the principles of modern warfare, despite his occasional early successes in the contest. Others point out that his ideology prevented him from accepting defeat, because doing so would have meant admitting that the supposed German racial superiority was a myth. And others suggest that, by this point in the war, Hitler had simply lost contact with reality, living in a fantasy world where miracle weapons and unbreakable willpower could overcome any material disadvantage. What is indisputable is that Hitler's decisions in this period dramatically accelerated the collapse of the Third Reich. Every order to resist to the last cartridge, every prohibition of tactical retreat, every dismissal of competent generals, contributed to weakening even further an army that was already on the verge of exhaustion. Junio of 1944 brought with it the event that Hitler and his generals had anticipated with apprehension for years, the Allied invasion of Western Europe. The 6th of June, known as D-Day, British, American, Canadian, and other Allied nations' forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. It was the largest amphibious operation in history, involving thousands of ships, airplanes, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The initial German response was chaotic. Part of the problem was that Hitler was asleep when the invasion began, and his subordinates did not dare to wake him to authorize the movement of the armoured reserve divisions. By the time the Führer woke up and made decisions, the Allies had already established beachheads that would be extremely difficult to eliminate. But even after waking, Hitler committed fatal errors, convinced that Normandy was only a distraction, and that the real landing would come at Pas-de-Calais. He kept some of his best units immobile during critical days. This conviction, fed in part by a brilliant Allied deception operation, called Operation Fortitude, allowed the invaders to consolidate their positions and begin to expand into the interior of France. The following weeks saw ferocious combat in the Norman Bocage, that landscape of dense hedges and small fields that enormously favoured the defenders. The Germans fought with determination and skill, inflicting significant casualties on the Allies. But they lacked the resources to sustain this resistance indefinitely. Allied air superiority was overwhelming. Any German movement during the day attracted immediate devastating attacks from fighter bombers, Supplies arrived in dribs and drabs through lines of communication constantly bombarded, and casualties could not be replaced at the same rhythm as the Allies. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the catastrophe took on biblical proportions. The 22nd of June of 1944, exactly 3 years after the start of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration. It was a massive offensive against the German Army Group Center, and its results were devastating. In a matter of weeks, Army Group Center practically ceased to exist as an effective combat force. 28 German divisions were destroyed or severely damaged. More than 300,000 German soldiers died or were captured. The Soviets advanced hundreds of kilometers, liberating Belarus and reaching the borders of Poland and the Baltic states. It was one of the greatest military defeats in the history of Germany, surpassing even Stalingrad in terms of total losses. And unlike Stalingrad, where at least there was an epic resistance that propagandists could transform into a myth of sacrifice, Army Group Center simply disintegrated. Entire divisions surrendered. Generals were captured. Defensive lines that were supposedly impenetrable were breached in hours. How did Hitler react to this disaster? With fury, of course. He dismissed commanders. He ordered courts-martial. He demanded counterattacks that were physically impossible to execute. But also, according to some testimonies, he began to show something he had rarely exhibited before: moments of recognition that the war might be lost. These moments were fleeting. They were quickly replaced by new fantasies about miracle weapons, about divisions that did not exist, about enemy alliances that were about to fragment. But they existed, and those who witnessed them began to wonder if the Führer was finally accepting reality, even if only in brief flashes of lucidity. The 20th of July of 1944 marked a dramatic turning point. That day, while Hitler was conducting a military conference at his headquarters in the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, a bomb exploded a few meters from where he was standing. The device had been placed by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, an aristocratic officer who had lost an eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers of his left hand in combat in North Africa. Stauffenberg was part of a group of conspirators that included generals, diplomats, politicians, and civilians who had reached the conclusion that Hitler was leading Germany toward total destruction. His plan was simple in concept, but enormously complex in execution. Kill Hitler, take control of the government through a coup d'etat, and negotiate an armistice with the Western Allies before Germany was completely destroyed. The bomb exploded. 4 people died. Hitler survived. How was it possible that Hitler survived such a close explosion? The answer involves a series of coincidences that seem taken from a novel. The conference was originally scheduled to take place in a reinforced concrete bunker, where the shockwave would have been contained and amplified, surely killing everyone present. But due to the summer heat, the meeting was moved to a wooden structure with open windows, which allowed much of the force of the explosion to dissipate. Furthermore, at the moment of the detonation, Hitler was leaning over a massive oak map table that absorbed part of the shrapnel. And to top it off, another officer had inadvertently moved the briefcase containing the bomb behind one of the heavy legs of the table, placing it between Hitler and the explosive. Hitler walked out of the structure stumbling, with his uniform destroyed, his hair singed, his eardrums damaged, and multiple superficial wounds. But he was alive, and his survival would have devastating consequences for the conspirators and for Germany in general. The following hours were of total confusion. In Berlin, the conspirators had set in motion Operation Valkyrie, a plan that had originally been designed to maintain order in case of a revolt by the millions of foreign forced labourers in Germany, but which was now being used to attempt to take control of the government. For a few hours, it seemed that the coup might succeed. Army reserve units occupied key government buildings. The conspirators arrested SS and police officers. Communications were interrupted. But when it became clear that Hitler had survived, the tide turned rapidly. Officers who had been waiting to see which way the wind blew began to declare their loyalty to the Führer. The units that had arrested Nazi officials now released them and arrested the conspirators. By midnight, it was all over. Stauffenberg and other leaders of the coup were summarily executed in the courtyards of the army headquarters in Berlin. The repression that followed was brutal, even by Nazi standards. The Gestapo arrested thousands of people, many of whom had no real connection to the conspiracy. The trials, if they can be called that, were orchestrated spectacles where Judge Roland Freisler humiliated the accused before sentencing them to death. The executions were carried out by hanging with piano wire to maximize the suffering. Hitler ordered the executions to be filmed so he could watch them in private. But beyond the immediate repression, the assassination attempt had a profound effect on Hitler's psyche. If before he had been distrustful of his generals, now he became paranoid to the extreme. Any officer who questioned his orders, however reasonable their objections might be, ran the risk of being accused of defeatism or even participation in the conspiracy. The already limited flow of honest information toward Hitler was reduced even further, as no one wanted to be the bearer of bad news. And military decisions, which before allowed at least some debate, were now taken increasingly in isolation, based on the whims of a leader whose judgment was severely compromised. August of 1944 brought more disasters. On the Western Front, Allied forces finally broke the encirclement in Normandy and began a pursuit that would make the German blitzkriegs of 1940 seem slow. Paris was liberated on the 25th of August, a devastating blow to German prestige. German forces in the south of France, threatened with being isolated after the Allied landing on the Riviera, undertook a hasty retreat toward the north. By the end of the month, the Allies had liberated almost all of France and Belgium and were approaching the borders of the Reich itself. Hitler, typically, blamed everyone but himself. The generals were traitors. The soldiers were cowards. The German people were not up to the height of their historic destiny. In one of his conferences from this era, he went so far as to say that if Germany lost the war, it would mean that it did not deserve to survive as a nation. It was an extraordinary declaration that revealed the extent to which Hitler had come to identify his own destiny with that of the entire German people, to the point of being willing to drag them with him to destruction. Did Hitler really think that Germany deserved to be destroyed if it lost? Testimonies from those who knew him suggest that yes, at least in his darkest moments. For Hitler, history was a Darwinian struggle between races where only the strongest survived. If Germany, supposedly the master race, was defeated by races he considered inferior, then clearly the Germans had not been so superior after all. In his twisted logic, total destruction was preferable to dishonourable defeat. This mentality would have catastrophic consequences in the coming months. September of 1944 offered a brief respite for the Germans, although not by their own merit. The Allies, advancing too fast for their supply lines, were forced to stop and consolidate their positions. An ambitious attempt to end the war before Christmas through an airborne operation in the Netherlands, known as Operation Market Garden, ended in failure when British forces at Arnhem were annihilated. The Germans took advantage of this pause to stabilise their western front, building new defensive lines along the border of the Reich. But in the east, there was no respite. The Soviets continued their relentless advance. Romania, which had been an ally of Germany, switched sides after a coup d'etat in August, depriving the Reich of a vital source of oil. Bulgaria followed the same path days later. Finland, which had fought alongside Germany against the Soviet Union since 1941, signed an armistice with Moscow. The ring around the Reich tightened inexorably. In October, the Soviets entered East Prussia, stepping on German soil for the first time. The atrocities they committed against the civilian population, although exaggerated by Nazi propaganda, were very real. Decades of accumulated hatred, combined with the thirst for vengeance for German crimes on Soviet territory, were unleashed in a wave of violence that included looting, murders, and massive rapes. When news of what was happening reached the rest of Germany, fear of the Red Army turned into generalized panic. Hitler tried to use this fear to galvanize the population. Propaganda presented the fight against the Soviets as a matter of existential survival, which, given the atrocities that were being committed, was not entirely false. New units of the Volkssturm were formed, a popular militia composed of old men and adolescents who had previously been considered unfit for military service. Anti-tank trenches were dug around the cities. Improvised weapons were distributed to civilians. But these desperate measures could not compensate for the crushing material superiority of the Allies. Germany was being strangled. Allied bombings had destroyed a large part of its industrial capacity. Production of synthetic oil, vital for a nation with limited access to crude, had been drastically reduced. Trains transporting troops and supplies to the front were constantly attacked from the air, and casualties at the front could not be replaced. Germany was simply running out of people. November of 1944 found Hitler facing a crucial decision. With limited resources, he had to choose where to concentrate his last strategic reserves. The logical option would have been the Eastern Front, where the Soviets represented the greatest threat and where a total defeat would mean the complete destruction of Germany. But Hitler, typically, chose the opposite. His plan was to launch a massive offensive in the west through the Ardennes, the same sector where the Germans had invaded France in 1940. The objective was to split the Allied forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the British and Americans to negotiate a separate peace. With the Western Front stabilized, Germany could then concentrate all its forces against the Soviets. It was a bold plan. It was also completely delusional. The generals who heard it were stupefied. Where would the troops come from? And the fuel? And the air cover? Hitler dismissed all objections. The troops would be found scraping the bottom of the barrel. Fuel would be captured from Allied depots. The operation would be launched during a period of bad weather that would keep Allied aviation grounded. The Ardennes offensive, known by the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, began on the 16th of December of 1944. Initially, it achieved complete tactical surprise. The Germans concentrated 25 divisions against a sector of the front defended by only 4 American divisions, many of them rookie or exhausted units that had been sent to that quiet sector to rest or train. German forces advanced rapidly, creating a bulge in the Allied lines that gave the battle its name. The first days were of confusion and panic among the Allies. American units were surrounded and annihilated. The Germans captured thousands of prisoners and large quantities of supplies. Commando teams disguised in American uniforms sowed chaos behind enemy lines, changing traffic signs and spreading false rumors. For a moment, it seemed that Hitler's bold plan could work. But the problems soon became evident. The advance was slower than planned. The roads, narrow and winding in the mountainous terrain of the Ardennes, congested easily. And most critical, the Germans were not capturing the fuel they desperately needed. Armoured units began to run out of gasoline in the middle of their advance. The turning point came at Bastogne, a small Belgian town that was a crucial road junction. The American 101st Airborne Division, surrounded by vastly superior German forces, refused to surrender. When the German commander sent an ultimatum demanding surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe responded with a single word that would go down in history: nuts, which can be politely translated as nonsense, but actually had a much cruder meaning. The resistance of Bastogne delayed the German advance long enough for the Allies to reorganize their forces. General Patton, in one of the boldest maneuvers of the war, turned his Third Army 90 degrees and marched north through brutal winter to relieve Bastogne. When the weather improved, Allied aviation was able to finally intervene, devastating the German columns exposed on the roads. By the end of December, it was clear that the offensive had failed. The Germans had advanced about 100 kilometers at their deepest point, but they never got close to their strategic objectives, and the cost had been catastrophic. More than 100,000 German casualties, including some of their best soldiers and officers. Tanks and vehicles that could not be replaced were destroyed or abandoned for lack of fuel. The reserves that Hitler had accumulated for months evaporated in weeks. The Battle of the Bulge was the last significant German offensive of the war. After it, Germany could only retreat and defend, and it had nothing to do it with. The year 1945 began with a desperate military situation for the Third Reich. In the West, the Allies had recovered all the territory lost in the Ardennes and were preparing to cross the Rhine, the last important natural barrier before the heart of Germany. In the East, the Soviets accumulated enormous forces for the final offensive that would take them to Berlin. In Italy, Allied forces continued their slow advance toward the north. In the skies, the Luftwaffe had been practically destroyed, leaving German cities defenseless before the bombings that reduced them to rubble night after night. Hitler spent New Year's at his headquarters on the Western Front, still clinging to the hope that the Ardennes offensive could be reversed. But by the 10th of January, even he had to accept that it had failed. He ordered a gradual retreat, although characteristically he refused to allow a complete retreat that would have saved many German lives. On the 12th of January of 1945, the Soviets launched their winter offensive. It was an operation of unprecedented scale, involving millions of soldiers along a front of hundreds of kilometers. German defenses, already weakened by the transfer of troops to the west for the Ardennes offensive, collapsed like a house of cards. The Soviet advance was so fast that it surprised even the Russian commanders themselves. In 2 weeks, the Red Army advanced 500 kilometers, liberating most of Poland and reaching the Oder River, only 60 kilometers from Berlin. Cities that the Germans had planned to defend to the last cartridge fell in days or even hours. Entire divisions were surrounded and annihilated before they could retreat. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." This way you will encourage us to bring more historical topics, and you will also help with the engagement of the video, okay? Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like, so YouTube continues recommending our videos to you. What was Hitler doing while his empire collapsed? Incredibly, during the first weeks of the Soviet offensive, the Führer remained at his headquarters on the Western Front, obsessed with the situation in the Ardennes, which was already irrelevant. It was not until the 15th of January that he finally returned to Berlin, and by then the situation was irreparable. On the 16th of January of 1945, Hitler descended into the subterranean bunker beneath the new Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Originally designed as a temporary shelter during bombings, this reinforced concrete labyrinth would become his permanent residence for the last 105 days of his life. He would never see the light of the sun on a regular basis again. The Führer bunker, as it was known, was an impressive structure from a technical point of view, but depressingly claustrophobic as a place of habitation. Situated 8 meters underground, its concrete walls almost 4 meters thick could withstand direct impacts from the largest bombs of the era. It was equipped with its own ventilation system, electric generators, water supply, and sufficient provisions to sustain its occupants for months. But it was also a gloomy place, with low ceilings, constant artificial lighting, and stale air that was never completely renewed despite the ventilation systems. Those who lived and worked there described an oppressive, almost unreal atmosphere, where the passage of time lost all meaning, and where news from the outside world arrived filtered and distorted. For Hitler, however, the bunker represented a kind of sanctuary. There he could control his environment in a way that was no longer possible in the chaos of the outside world. There his orders were still obeyed, at least within the concrete walls. There he could maintain the illusion that he was still in command. February of 1945 brought a series of devastating blows. On the 13th of February, Allied forces bombed Dresden in one of the most controversial air operations of the war. For 2 days, waves of British and American bombers unloaded thousands of tons of incendiary bombs on the historic city, creating a firestorm that killed tens of thousands of people, the majority civilians. The destruction of Dresden, although militarily questionable, was presented by Nazi propaganda as proof of Allied barbarism. Hitler ordered that the casualty figures be exaggerated, going so far as to claim that more than 200,000 people had died, when the real figure was probably between 25,000 and 35,000. The intention was to galvanize the German population to continue fighting, presenting surrender as equivalent to total annihilation. But by this point, the majority of Germans were too exhausted, frightened, and demoralized to respond to propaganda. German cities were bombed almost daily. Food was scarce, basic services collapsed. Refugees from the east arrived in waves, bringing stories of atrocities that sowed panic. People no longer believed in victory. They only wanted the nightmare to end. Hitler, however, continued demanding resistance to death. In one of his last public appearances, on the 24th of February of 1945, he read a message to the troops in which he stated that the war would end with the victory of Germany. It was a speech so divorced from reality that even some of his most loyal followers began to doubt his sanity. March brought the fall of the last German defences in the west. On the 7th of March, American troops captured the Remagen Bridge over the Rhine intact, crossing to the other side before the Germans could destroy it. Hitler flew into a rage, ordering the execution of the officers responsible for defending the bridge. But the damage was done. The Allies now had a bridgehead east of the Rhine from which to expand. In the following weeks, the Allies crossed the Rhine at multiple points, overwhelming the remaining German defences. The German army in the west disintegrated rapidly, with entire units surrendering before the Allied advance. German soldiers, many of them adolescents or old men without adequate training, preferred capture by the Americans or British to continuing a fight without hope. And what was happening on the Eastern Front meanwhile? The Soviets, after their astounding advance in January, had paused briefly to consolidate their lines and accumulate supplies. But by the end of March, they were ready for the final assault on Berlin. The front now extended along the Oder River, a distance from the German capital that could be travelled by car in an hour in peacetime. The Soviet forces gathered there were overwhelming. 2.5 million soldiers, more than 6,000 tanks, more than 40,000 artillery pieces, and more than 7,000 planes. Against them, the Germans could barely gather 1 million combatants, many of them old men from the Volkssturm or members of the Hitler Youth who barely knew how to fire a weapon. Hitler, typically, refused to accept these realities. In his military conferences, he moved divisions that no longer existed, ordered counterattacks with units that lacked fuel to move, and promised that the situation would change thanks to secret weapons or the inevitable fragmentation of the alliance between the Western capitalists and the Soviet communists. This last fantasy was particularly persistent. Hitler was convinced that the Allied coalition could not survive once they found themselves face to face on German soil. Tensions between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, he argued, were too deep to be overcome. At any moment, he predicted, these tensions would explode into open conflict, and Germany could then ally itself with one of the sides against the other. It was not a completely absurd idea. In fact, the tensions that would eventually lead to the Cold War were already evident to attentive observers. But the notion that this rupture would occur in time to save the Third Reich was pure fantasy. And the idea that the Allies, after everything the Nazis had done, would accept Germany as a partner in any configuration was simply delirious. The 20th of April of 1945 marked the 56th and final birthday of Adolf Hitler. The celebrations were a pathetic shadow of previous years. There were no massive parades, nor speeches in packed stadiums. Instead, a small group of loyalists gathered in the bunker to offer their congratulations to a Führer who could barely stand up. Photographs and footage from that day show an unrecognizable Hitler. The dictator who had once captivated millions with his magnetic presence was now a premature, hunched, trembling old man. With a swollen face and dull eyes, his left arm hung limp at his side, shaken by tremors he could no longer hide. His movements were slow and clumsy. His voice, once capable of electrifying crowds, was now a hoarse whisper. The visitors who saw him that day were shocked. Albert Speer, Hitler's favourite architect turned armaments minister, later described the impression of seeing someone who was already dead but had not yet realised it. Others used similar terms: a walking corpse, a ghost, the shadow of a being who was once powerful. After the brief birthday ceremonies, Hitler had to make a crucial decision. Several of his closest collaborators urged him to leave Berlin before it was too late. The Soviets were about to encircle the city. Once that happened, escape would be impossible. If Hitler wanted to continue leading the war, they argued, he should move to the Bavarian Alps, where remaining German forces could consolidate in a national redoubt for a last stand. Hitler hesitated. For several days, he seemed to seriously consider the option of fleeing to the south. He ordered part of his staff and documentation to be evacuated to Bavaria. He allowed several of his closest collaborators, including Hermann Göring, to leave Berlin. He even mentioned the possibility that he himself might follow them soon. But in the end, he decided to stay. The exact reasons for this decision remain a subject of debate among historians. Some suggest that Hitler was simply too physically and mentally weakened to undertake the journey. Others argue that his ego did not allow him to flee like a coward, while his soldiers died defending the capital. And still others suggest that, on some level, Hitler had accepted that the war was lost and had decided to die in Berlin as a final dramatic gesture. What is certain is that the decision to stay sealed his fate, and that of all those who remained with him. On the 21st of April, the first Soviet artillery shells began to fall on the centre of Berlin. It was the beginning of the final battle. The Battle of Berlin was one of the bloodiest confrontations of the entire Second World War. For 2 weeks, Soviet and German soldiers fought house by house, street by street, room by room, in an orgy of violence that left the city converted into a lunar landscape of rubble and corpses. The German forces defending the capital were a heterogeneous mix of regular Wehrmacht units, SS battalions, members of the Volkssturm, and even children from the Hitler Youth. Many fought with a ferocity born of desperation, knowing that surrender to the Soviets likely meant death or something worse. Others, especially the youngest, fought because it was all they knew, having been indoctrinated since childhood to die for the Führer. The Soviets, for their part, were determined to take the city as quickly as possible, regardless of the cost. Stalin had ordered that Berlin be captured before the 1st of May, International Workers' Day, to be able to announce the victory as a gift to the workers of the world. This political pressure led to brutal tactics that cost thousands of additional Soviet lives, but also accelerated the fall of the city. While the battle raged in the streets above him, Hitler spent his days in the bunker, in a state of unreality increasingly pronounced. His military conferences had turned into endless monologues, where the Führer rambled about past betrayals, missed opportunities, and imaginary enemies. He moved units on maps that no longer corresponded to any reality, ordering counterattacks with armies that had ceased to exist days or weeks before. When his subordinates dared to point out that his orders were impossible to fulfill, Hitler exploded in fits of rage that left everyone present in terrified silence. He accused his generals of treason, of cowardice, of deliberately sabotaging his brilliant plans. He shouted that he was surrounded by liars and incompetence. And then, as suddenly as he had erupted, he would collapse into an apathetic silence that could last hours. The 22nd of April marked the final turning point. During the military conference of that day, Hitler asked for the status of the counterattack he had ordered the previous day. It was supposed that General Felix Steiner, in command of an armoured corps, would attack the flanks of the Soviet forces advancing toward Berlin, relieving pressure on the city. When they informed him that the attack had not materialized because Steiner did not count on the necessary forces to execute it, Hitler suffered a complete nervous breakdown. Those present described a scene that no one had witnessed before. The Führer, trembling violently, screaming in a hoarse voice, accusing everyone of treason, declaring that the war was lost, that he would stay in Berlin, that he would commit suicide before falling into enemy hands. It was the first time that Hitler openly admitted to his subordinates that the war was lost. And although in the following days he had moments of relative calm, and even of renewed, irrational optimism, the essence of what he said that day did not change. Hitler had accepted his fate. The following days were of accelerated disintegration. Communications with the outside world became increasingly sporadic. The news arriving at the bunker was fragmentary and often contradictory. Hitler oscillated between states of apathy and bursts of frenetic activity, dictating orders that no one could or wanted to fulfill. On the 23rd of April, news arrived that Hermann Göring, second in command of the Reich, had sent a telegram from Bavaria asking if he should assume leadership of the country, given that Hitler was incapacitated in Berlin. Hitler interpreted this as an attempted coup d'etat and ordered Göring's arrest. The Reich Marshal, who for years had been one of the most powerful Nazis, was stripped of all his positions and titles, accused of treason. 2 days later, Hitler received another devastating piece of news. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and one of the principal architects of the Nazi repressive apparatus, was secretly negotiating with the Western Allies, offering the surrender of Germany in exchange for being treated with leniency. For Hitler, it was the definitive betrayal. Himmler, the faithful Heinrich, the most loyal executor of his most atrocious policies, had abandoned him. Hitler's reaction was characteristic. He ordered Himmler's arrest, although he knew that this order would probably never be carried out. And as symbolic revenge, he ordered the execution of Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's liaison officer in the bunker, who was also Eva Braun's brother-in-law. Fegelein was dragged from the bunker and shot in the Chancellery Garden, accused of attempting to desert. While the circle around Hitler shrank to a handful of irredeemable loyalists, the dictator made 2 final decisions. The first was to marry Eva Braun, the woman who had been his companion for more than a decade, but who had never been publicly recognized. The ceremony, brief and devoid of any romanticism, took place in the early morning of the 29th of April. A minor official officiated the civil marriage, while Soviet shells fell a few hundred meters away. Why did Hitler decide to marry Eva Braun in his final hours? Interpretations vary. Some see in it a gesture of belated affection toward a woman whose devotion had been unbreakable, despite years of being treated as a shameful secret. Others interpret it as an act of final vanity, ensuring that Hitler would die as a respectable husband, instead of as the bachelor who had always claimed to be dedicated totally to Germany. And others suggest that it was simply a legal convenience that facilitated the disposition of Hitler's assets after his death. The second decision was to dictate his political testament, an extraordinary document that reveals Hitler's mentality in his final hours. Instead of admitting any responsibility for the disasters he had caused, the testament blamed the war exclusively on the Jews and the international clique of bankers and politicians. He reiterated the obsessive hatred that had guided his life and that had led to the murder of millions of innocents. And he urged the Germans to continue the fight against the poisoning of all peoples that the Jews supposedly represented. It was a sick, delirious document, full of the same toxic mix of paranoia and megalomania that had characterized Hitler's entire political career. And it was also, in a certain sense, perfectly coherent. Hitler died as he had lived, without repentance, without introspection, without any capacity to recognize the suffering he had caused. On the 30th of April of 1945, Adolf Hitler woke up for the last time. Soviet forces were now less than 500 meters from the bunker, fighting their way toward the Reich Chancellery. There was no escape possible. The end had arrived. After lunch, Hitler gathered his innermost circle to say goodbye. He shook hands mechanically, uttered empty words of comfort, and then retired to his private rooms with Eva Braun. A few minutes later, those waiting outside heard a single shot. When they entered the room, they found Hitler slumped on a sofa with a bullet hole in his right temple. Beside him, Eva Braun was also dead, having ingested a cyanide capsule. The Walter pistol that Hitler had used lay at his feet. The bodies were carried to the Chancellery garden, placed in a shallow trench, doused with gasoline, and burned. The flames consumed the remains, while Soviet shells continued to fall all around. There was no ceremony, no final words, nothing of the elaborate ritual that Hitler had always demanded in life, only flames and smoke, and the roar of artillery marking the end of an empire of nightmare. Thus ended Adolf Hitler, not in glory, as he had always dreamed, but in a hole in the ground, burned like trash, while the world he had tried to dominate crumbled around him. But Hitler's death was not the end of the story. The Third Reich, that monstrous structure he had built, took a few more days to collapse completely. On the same day as Hitler's death, Admiral Karl Dönitz, whom Hitler had named as his successor in the political testament, assumed the office of President of the Reich. It was an absurd succession in many ways. Dönitz, a submarine admiral who had carefully avoided getting involved in party politics, inherited an empire that no longer existed. His government consisted of a handful of officials gathered in the port city of Flensburg, near the Danish border. His army was disintegrating, with soldiers surrendering en masse or fleeing west to avoid Soviet capture. Dönitz tried to negotiate a partial surrender that would allow as many German troops and civilians as possible to escape the Soviet zone toward the west. For a few days, he achieved some success, gaining time while hundreds of thousands of people fled the advance of the Red Army. But the Allies, who had already agreed that Germany must surrender unconditionally to all Allied powers simultaneously, were not going to permit Dönitz to play one against the others. On the 7th of May of 1945, representatives of the Dönitz government signed the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces at the Allied headquarters in Reims, France. The next day, to satisfy Soviet demands, the ceremony was repeated in Berlin. The war in Europe had officially ended. But the collapse of the Third Reich was much more than a military defeat. It was also the collapse of an ideology, of a vision of the world, of a belief system that had led to a level of destruction unprecedented in history. In the following months and years, the world began to understand the magnitude of the crimes the Nazis had committed. Concentration and extermination camps, which had been the subject of rumours and fragmentary reports during the war, were now exposed in all their monstrous reality. Images from Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen and dozens of other places of death travelled the world, provoking horror, disbelief, and in some cases, the determination that such atrocities should never be repeated. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November of 1945, attempted to establish the legal responsibility of Nazi leaders for their crimes. It was an unprecedented process. Never before had an attempt been made to judge the leaders of a defeated nation for crimes against humanity. The accused included figures who had been at the summit of Nazi power: Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, Speer, and many others. Some were sentenced to death, others to long prison terms, and a few were acquitted. But many of those responsible escaped justice. Himmler committed suicide shortly after being captured by the British. Goebbels had committed suicide along with his wife after murdering their 6 children in Hitler's bunker. Bormann disappeared in the chaos of the fall of Berlin, and although he was sentenced to death in absentia at Nuremberg, his fate was not confirmed until decades later, when his remains were identified in Berlin, and thousands of lower-ranking criminals managed to flee to South America, the Middle East, and other places, where they lived the rest of their lives under false identities. How could all this happen? How was it possible that a cultured, educated nation, with a rich philosophical, scientific, and artistic tradition, let itself be dragged into such an abyss of barbarism? How was it possible that millions of people followed a leader obviously demented toward total destruction? These questions have been debated for decades and will likely never have a completely satisfactory answer. The factors that contributed to the rise and fall of Nazism were multiple and complex. The humiliations of the Treaty of Versailles, the economic instability of the Weimar Republic, the fear of communism, anti-Semitism rooted in European culture, the weakness of democratic institutions, the propagandistic skill of the Nazis, and the passivity of those who could have stopped them when it was still possible. But at the centre of it all was the figure of Adolf Hitler, an individual whose combination of charisma, cruelty, and delusions of grandeur was capable of catalysing the worst tendencies of his era and converting them into a movement of unprecedented destruction. The last 365 days of Hitler were, in many ways, the logical culmination of everything that had come before. They were days of catastrophic decisions taken by a leader whose judgment was fatally compromised. They were days of unimaginable suffering for millions of people, both victims of the Nazis and ordinary Germans trapped in the collapse of a regime that had promised 1,000 years of dominion but barely lasted 12. But this is where history becomes even more fascinating, because what we have just narrated is only the surface of what really happened during those last 365 days. There are deeper layers, darker secrets, and details that reveal the true nature of the Nazi collapse in ways few know. What was really happening inside the walls of the bunker while Berlin burned above it? Who were the people who chose to stay with Hitler until the end? And why did they take that apparently suicidal decision? What conversations were had in those subterranean corridors that were never officially recorded? And what do the testimonies of the survivors reveal about the mental state of the dictator in his final weeks? To answer these questions, we must return to the bunker and examine in greater detail what happened inside. The Führer bunker was not simply an air raid shelter. It was a microcosm of the Third Reich in miniature, with its own hierarchies, intrigues, and personal dramas. Approximately 50 people lived permanently in its facilities during the final weeks, although the number fluctuated constantly as some fled and others arrived. There were 2 main levels, the Vorbunker, or upper bunker, which housed service personnel and some minor officials, and the Führer bunker proper, where Hitler and his innermost circle resided. Daily routine in the bunker had acquired its own rhythm, completely disconnected from the outside world. Hitler, who had always been nocturnal in his habits, now slept until well into the afternoon. His military conferences typically began around 4 or 5 in the afternoon and could extend for hours. Then came dinner, followed by tea sessions that dragged on until the early hours of the morning, where Hitler monologued endlessly on his favourite subjects: architecture, history, his dogs, and increasingly the betrayals he imagined all around him. Eva Braun, the companion the world barely knew, played a curious role in these final days. For years, she had been kept in the shadows, a presence everyone in the inner circle knew but officially did not exist. Now, with the world crumbling, paradoxically she emerged more than ever. She organised small parties in the upper rooms of the Chancellery, where they danced and drank champagne, while Soviet shells fell outside. It was a surreal scene, young secretaries and officers dancing waltzes and foxtrots, while artillery shook the foundations of the building. Why did Eva Braun choose to stay? She had had multiple opportunities to flee south, to the relative safety of Bavaria where her family waited, Hitler himself had suggested she leave, but she refused flatly. In one of her last letters to her sister, she wrote that she preferred to die with Hitler than live without him. It was a devotion many found incomprehensible, especially considering how Hitler had treated her for years, keeping her hidden, ignoring her for weeks while attending to affairs of state, never publicly acknowledging her. Historians have debated the exact nature of the relationship between Hitler and Eva Braun. Some describe it as a form of genuine love, although distorted. Others view it as a pathological dependence on her part and a convenience on his part. What is indisputable is that Eva Braun remained loyal to the end, and that her presence in the bunker provided Hitler with an emotional anchor in the midst of chaos. But Eva Braun was not the only woman in the bunker who had chosen a tragic fate. Magda Goebbels, wife of the propaganda minister, was also there with her 6 children, and her story is perhaps the most disturbing of all those that unfolded in those subterranean corridors. Magda Goebbels had been described as the First Lady of the Third Reich. Although she never held that title officially, she was a constant presence at Nazi events, always elegant, always smiling, the face of the ideal Aryan family. Her 6 children, whose names all began with the letter H in supposed honour of Hitler, were regularly exhibited in regime propaganda as examples of perfect German youth. When Joseph Goebbels decided that he and his family would remain in Berlin to die together with Hitler, Magda supported the decision, but she went further. She declared that her children would also die, because a world without National Socialism was not a world worth living in. It was a chilling declaration that revealed the extent to which Nazi ideology had corrupted even the most basic maternal instincts. The Goebbels children, whose ages ranged from 4 to 12 years, were brought to the bunker in the final days of April. According to survivor testimonies, they did not completely understand what was happening. They played in the corridors, sang songs, and tried to cheer up the depressed adults surrounding them. They did not know that their own parents had decided they would not survive the fall of the Reich. How could a mother make such a decision? It is a question that has tormented historians and psychologists for decades. Some argue that Magda Goebbels was so deeply indoctrinated that she genuinely believed she was protecting her children from a worse fate. Others suggest that her devotion to Hitler, with whom she was rumoured to have been in love, surpassed her love for her own children. And others point out signs of mental instability that had manifested over years. What we know with certainty is what happened on the 1st of May of 1945, one day after Hitler's death. Magda Goebbels administered sedatives to her 6 children, supposedly telling them it was medicine. Once they were unconscious, she introduced cyanide capsules into their mouths and crushed them. The 6 children died in minutes. Shortly after, Magda and Joseph Goebbels went up to the Chancery Garden, where they committed suicide with cyanide and pistol, following their Führer's example. The murder of the Goebbels children represents perhaps the most monstrous act committed inside the bunker, an intimate atrocity that in some way captures the essence of Nazism better than the statistics of millions of victims, because it demonstrates how ideology can absolutely corrupt everything it touches, including the most sacred bond between parents and children. But let us return a bit in time, because there are aspects of Hitler's final months that deserve a deeper exploration. What do we really know about Hitler's health status during his final year of life? Testimonies from those who saw him regularly paint a picture of accelerated deterioration that is difficult to explain solely by the stress of war. Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler's personal physician, kept detailed records of the treatments he administered. These records, captured by the Americans after the war, reveal a medical regimen that today would seem absurd and dangerous. Hitler received daily injections of a mixture that included glucose, vitamins, bull testicle extracts, and small amounts of strychnine. He also took pills containing methamphetamine, a stimulant we know today as a highly addictive drug with severe side effects. The effects of this chemical cocktail on Hitler are difficult to evaluate with precision. Methamphetamine could explain some of his erratic behaviours, bursts of energy followed by periods of exhaustion, difficulty sleeping, increasing paranoia, and impulsive decisions that defied all military logic. But there were also symptoms that did not fit the stimulant abuse profile: the progressive tremor of his left arm, the rigidity of his movements, and the deterioration of his posture. Modern medical researchers who have examined Morell's records and eyewitness testimonies have reached different conclusions. Some believe he suffered from Parkinson's disease, a degenerative neurological condition that would explain the tremors and rigidity. Others suggest he could have suffered from cerebral arteriosclerosis, a hardening of the brain's arteries that can cause cognitive deterioration. And still others argue that the symptoms can be explained primarily by the effects of the drugs Morell administered, combined with extreme stress and lack of sleep. What is indisputable is that the Hitler of 1945 was a shadow of the leader who had captivated Germany a decade earlier. His capacity for strategic thinking, which had never been as brilliant as he believed, but at least had been functional, was now severely compromised. His decisions were based increasingly on fantasies and wishes, rather than realistic assessments of the situation, and his capacity to inspire others, which had been his greatest political strength, had almost completely disappeared. A revealing example of this deterioration occurred in March of 1945, when Hitler ordered what is known as the Nero Decree. This order, named after the Roman emperor, who supposedly set fire to Rome, instructed German authorities to destroy all the country's infrastructure, including factories, bridges, railways, communication facilities, and food stores, to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. It was an order of total destruction that would have condemned the German population to death by starvation and exposure, even if the war ended soon somehow. When Albert Speer, the armaments minister, protested that this would mean the end of the German people, Hitler responded with a declaration that revealed the depth of his nihilism. If the war is lost, the nation will also perish. This fate is inevitable. There is no need to take into consideration the basis which the people will need to continue a most primitive existence. In other words, Hitler was willing to take the entire German people to the grave with him. If Germany could not win, then Germany did not deserve to exist. It was the most extreme expression of the all-or-nothing mentality that had characterized his political career, now elevated to a level of genocidal madness, directed against his own people. Fortunately, the Nero Decree was never fully implemented. Speer, in one of the few acts of disobedience he dared to commit, secretly sabotaged the orders, instructing local officials to ignore them. Other officials simply lacked the resources or will to carry out such massive destruction. And the rapid Allied advance meant many areas fell into enemy hands before they could be destroyed. But the fact that Hitler issued such an order reveals something fundamental about his psychology in those final months. He no longer saw Germany as a nation to protect, but as an instrument of his own will that he could discard when it ceased to be useful. The German people, whom he claimed to lead and defend, had become an expendable accessory to his personal drama. This disconnection between Hitler and the reality of German suffering manifested in other ways too. In his final weeks, he rarely asked about conditions for civilians in bombed cities. He expressed no concern for refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. When atrocities committed by the Red Army against the German population in the East were mentioned, his typical response was to blame the Germans themselves for not resisting sufficiently. Had it always been this way? Or was this contempt for his own people a development of his final months? Historians debate this point. Some argue that Hitler never genuinely cared about the welfare of the German people, but viewed them only as a means to his ends of power and conquest. Others suggest there was a real change in his attitude as the war turned against him, a transformation of the leader who at least pretended to care for his nation into someone who openly contemplated its destruction. What is clear is that, by the final months of the war, any pretense of governing for the benefit of the people had been abandoned. Orders emanating from the bunker served only two purposes: to prolong the war as long as possible, and to ensure that the final destruction was as complete as possible. It was the logic of a suicide who wants to take the greatest number of people with him. But while Hitler sank into his world of fantasy and destruction, others in his circle began to contemplate the future in very different ways. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and principal architect of the concentration camp system, began to negotiate secretly with Allied representatives as early as February 1945. His contacts, made through Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden, sought a separate surrender to the Western Allies that would save Germany from Soviet occupation. In exchange, Himmler was willing to hand over control of the remaining concentration camps and facilitate the release of prisoners. What did Himmler hope to obtain from these negotiations? Apparently, he believed the Western Allies would see him as a potential partner in the fight against communism and allow him to play some role in post-war Germany. It was an extraordinary fantasy coming from someone responsible for millions of murders, but Himmler seemed to genuinely believe his utility as an administrator, and his knowledge of the German security apparatus could make him indispensable. The Allies, of course, had no intention of negotiating with Himmler, nor with any other Nazi leader. Their policy of unconditional surrender left no room for separate deals that could benefit war criminals. But negotiations continued for weeks, fueled by Himmler's vanity and perhaps by Allied interest in obtaining information about Nazi operations. When Hitler learned of Himmler's negotiations on the 28th of April, his reaction was predictably furious, but it was also revealing of his mental state. Instead of recognizing that Himmler was simply doing what many other Nazis were already contemplating, which Hitler himself had done in different circumstances, the Führer saw it as a personal betrayal of cosmic proportions. Himmler, the faithful Heinrich, the most devoted executor of his most atrocious policies, had abandoned him. It was for Hitler definitive proof that he was surrounded by traitors. But Himmler was not alone in his maneuvers. Hermann Göring, second in command of the Reich and head of the Luftwaffe, also tried to position himself for the post-war era in ways that enraged Hitler. On the 23rd of April, Göring sent a telegram from Berchtesgaden, where he had taken refuge, asking if he should assume leadership of the Reich, given that Hitler was incapacitated in his freedom of action in Berlin. The telegram included a deadline. If he did not receive an answer by 10 at night, Göring would assume Hitler had lost the capacity to govern and would act accordingly. Göring's intention was probably not to betray Hitler, but simply to prepare for what seemed inevitable. But Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, who controlled access to the Führer, presented the telegram in the worst possible way. He described it as an ultimatum, an attempted coup d'etat, a betrayal comparable to Himmler's. Hitler, already paranoid beyond all reason, accepted this interpretation. He ordered Göring stripped of all his positions and titles, arrested for treason, and expelled from the party. The Reich Marshal, who for years had been one of the most visible and powerful Nazis, was reduced overnight to a prisoner awaiting trial. These last-minute purges revealed a fundamental characteristic of the Nazi regime that had been present from the beginning but now manifested with brutal clarity. Personal loyalty to Hitler was the only currency that mattered. Years of service, military or administrative achievements, ideological devotion. None of this protected anyone if Hitler decided they had been disloyal. And in his final days, with his paranoia reaching pathological levels, almost anyone could fall under suspicion. This atmosphere of fear and mistrust permeated the entire bunker. Those who remained there knew that a careless remark, a glance interpreted incorrectly, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could result in arrest or worse. Conversations became cautious, even between old comrades. Everyone watched everyone, fearing being denounced for any sign of defeatism or disloyalty. But at the same time, many of those remaining in the bunker had reached a state of resignation bordering on indifference. They knew the end was near. They knew they probably would not survive the fall of Berlin, either by enemy action or by their own choice. And faced with that certainty of imminent death, some of the normal constraints of behaviour relaxed. The parties Eva Brian organised in the upper rooms were an example of this. So too were the romantic relationships that blossomed at the last moment among bunker personnel, and the conversations when Hitler was not present, which openly admitted the war was lost and speculated about the future, if there was one. A particularly revealing testimony comes from Traudl Junge, one of Hitler's personal secretaries who survived the war. In her memoirs, she described the surreal atmosphere of those final days, the combination of bureaucratic routine with apocalyptic drama, the small daily worries persisting even as the world collapsed, and the strange intimacy that developed between people who knew they shared a common fate. Junge also provided intimate details about Hitler in his final weeks that contrast sharply with the image of the all-powerful dictator. She described him shuffling through the bunker corridors, clinging to the walls to maintain balance. She saw him trembling so violently he could barely hold a teacup, and she witnessed moments of unexpected tenderness, such as when Hitler petted his dog Blondie or when he spoke with affection about his youth in Austria. These details do not humanize Hitler in the sense of making him more likable, but they do show him as he was in those final days, a being deteriorated physically and mentally, clinging to the last vestiges of power while everything around him crumbled. He was not the evil genius of propaganda, nor the supernatural demon of nightmares. He was something perhaps more disturbing, an ordinary person in many ways, whose extraordinarily bad decisions had caused incalculable suffering. Now, let us pause for a moment to consider a question that has fascinated historians for decades. Could the war have ended differently if Hitler had died sooner? The assassination attempt on the 20th of July of 1944, led by Klaus von Stauffenberg, was extraordinarily close to succeeding. If the bomb had killed Hitler, what would have happened next? The conspirators had a detailed plan to take control of the government after Hitler's death. Army reserve units would arrest Nazi and SS leaders, while a new government would negotiate an armistice with the Allies. The hope was that, with Hitler out of the way, Germany could obtain more favourable peace terms than the unconditional surrender the Allies demanded. Was this realistic? Historians are divided. Some argue that, by July 1944, the Allies were so committed to the total destruction of Nazism that they would not have accepted any terms that were not unconditional surrender, regardless of who governed Germany. Others suggest that if a clearly anti-Nazi German government had taken power and offered to cooperate fully with the Allies, at least some of the horrors of the war's final months could have been avoided. What is certain is that Hitler's survival prolonged the war at least 9 more months, during which millions of additional people died. Extermination camps continued operating until they were liberated by Allied forces. German cities continued being bombed until reduced to rubble, and the Red Army, in its final advance toward Berlin, committed massive atrocities against the German civilian population that could have been avoided if the war had ended earlier. The 20th of July is, in many ways, one of the great what-ifs of 20th century history, and the answer, of course, is that we will never know for sure. But let us return to the narrative of the final days, because there are more details worth exploring. The 30th of April of 1945, the day of Hitler's death, began like any other day in the bunker. Hitler woke up late, around noon, and received the morning reports on the military situation. The news was uniformly bad. Soviet forces had crossed the Spree River and were fighting in the government district streets, less than a kilometre from the bunker. The ring around the Chancellery tightened hour by hour. Hitler lunched with his secretaries and with Eva Braun, who was now officially Eva Hitler, following the wedding ceremony the previous night. The meal was simple: pasta with tomato sauce, the vegetarian dish Hitler usually preferred. The conversation was superficial, avoiding obvious topics of death and defeat. According to testimonies, Hitler seemed calm, almost relieved, as if he had made a final decision and no longer had anything to worry about. After lunch, Hitler retired briefly to his private rooms. When he returned, he gathered his closest circle to say goodbye. He shook hands with his generals and aides. He embraced his secretaries, thanking them for their service. He spoke briefly with Magda Goebbels, who wept inconsolably. And finally, he took Eva's hand, and together they entered his private study. What exactly happened inside that room? Testimonies differ on minor details, but the general picture is clear. Hitler and Eva sat on a small sofa. She swallowed a cyanide capsule. He shot himself in the right temple with a Wolfer 7.65mm pistol, possibly after also biting a cyanide capsule to ensure the result. Those waiting outside heard a single shot around 3:30 in the afternoon. They waited a few minutes to ensure everything was finished and then entered. Hitler was slumped on the sofa with blood flowing from his head. Eva was by his side, without visible marks of violence, her face showing an expression some described as peaceful, others as surprised. The bodies were wrapped in blankets and carried to the Chancellery garden through the bunker's emergency stairs. They were placed in a shallow ditch, doused with approximately 200 litres of gasoline that had been stored for this purpose, and lit. The flames burned for several hours, while Soviet shells continued falling all around. The cremation was not complete. When the flames finally extinguished, the charred remains were buried hurriedly in the same ditch. But the Soviets, who arrived at the bunker a few days later, dug up the remains and subjected them to forensic examinations. For decades, the Soviet government kept the results of these examinations secret, fueling conspiracy theories about Hitler's possible survival. Finally, in the 90s, Soviet archives were opened and confirmed what most historians had always believed. Hitler died in the bunker on the 30th of April of 1945. The identified remains, including skull fragments, with a bullet hole and a dental prosthesis matching Hitler's dental records, were finally cremated completely and the ashes scattered in a river in 1970 to prevent the grave from becoming a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis. But Hitler's death did not put an immediate end to the suffering. The Battle of Berlin continued for 2 more days, with German defenders resisting desperately despite knowing their leader was dead. Only on the 2nd of May, when General Helmut Weidlin, commander of Berlin's defence, ordered the cessation of hostilities, did the fighting finally end in the capital. The cost had been astronomical. It is estimated that between 80,000 and 100,000 German soldiers and civilians died during the battle. Soviet casualties were equally severe, with some calculations suggesting up to 80,000 dead. The city itself had been reduced to rubble, with more than 70% of buildings in the centre destroyed or severely damaged. And amidst this destruction, atrocities occurred that Soviet authorities tried to hide for decades, but which historians have documented extensively. The massive rapes of German women, which began when the Red Army entered German territory and reached their peak during the capture of Berlin, represented one of the most extensive war crimes in history. It is estimated that between 100,000 and 1 million women were victims in Berlin alone, though the exact figures will never be known with certainty. Why did these atrocities occur? Explanations are multiple and none justify them. The desire for vengeance for crimes Germans had committed on Soviet territory, where millions of civilians had been murdered, undoubtedly played a role. So too did the disintegration of military discipline in the final weeks of the war, when officers lost control of their troops, and the hatred fueled by years of propaganda, both Nazi and Soviet, created a climate where violence against civilians was seen not only as permissible, but as deserved. The consequences of these atrocities resonated for generations. Thousands of German women became pregnant as a result of rapes, facing social stigma in a culture that blamed them for their own victimization. Many resorted to illegal abortions or suicide. Others raised their children in silence, never revealing the circumstances of their conception. Trauma was transmitted from mothers to children and grandchildren, creating psychological scars that persist to this day. But while Berlin agonized, the war continued in other parts of Germany. Scattered German units continued resisting on several fronts. some because they had not received orders to surrender, others because they preferred to die fighting, and others because they hoped to escape toward Western Allied lines before being captured by the Soviets. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had assumed leadership of the Reich after Hitler's death, tried for several days to negotiate a partial surrender that would permit German troops and civilians to flee the Soviet advance. His government, installed in the port city of Flensburg near the Danish border, was a farce recognized by no one internationally, but for a few days achieved some success in its objective of buying time. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers surrendered selectively to Western allies during the first week of May, preferring American or British captivity to Soviet. Millions of civilians also fled west in what was one of the largest population movements in history. Trains, roads, and ports were crowded with desperate refugees, abandoning everything they owned to escape the Red Army. But the Allies, who had agreed at Yalta to divide Germany into specific occupation zones, were not willing to let Dönitz play them against each other. On the 7th of May, representatives of the Dönitz government signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces at Allied headquarters in Reims, France. The next day, to satisfy Soviet demands for a formal ceremony in Berlin, the surrender was repeated. The war in Europe had officially ended, but the suffering was far from over. The following months saw the consolidation of Allied occupation of Germany and the start of the denazification process. Millions of Germans were interrogated about their political affiliations. Nazi Party members were removed from positions of authority, and major war criminals were gathered for the trial that would take place in Nuremberg starting in November. But the scale of Nazi crimes was so vast that complete justice was impossible. For every Nazi leader prosecuted at Nuremberg, thousands of minor perpetrators escaped any legal consequence. Some fled to South America or the Middle East with the help of clandestine networks. Others simply reintegrated into German society under false identities or taking advantage of collective amnesia that allowed many Germans to claim they had never been Nazis or knew nothing of what was happening. Adolf Eichmann, one of the main organizers of the extermination, escaped to Argentina where he lived under a false name until Israeli agents captured him in 1960. Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death of Auschwitz, who performed atrocious experiments on prisoners, also fled to South America where he died of a heart attack in 1979, never having faced justice, and many other criminals simply disappeared, their crimes forgotten or never investigated. The Nuremberg trials, which prosecuted 24 main Nazi leaders, were an unprecedented attempt to establish legal responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity. 12 of the accused were sentenced to death, though Hermann Göring committed suicide the night before his scheduled execution. Others received long prison terms, and 3 were acquitted, though they subsequently faced other proceedings in German courts. But beyond the trials, the true measure of Hitler's legacy was found in the ruins of Europe and in the shattered lives of millions of people. 6 million Jews had been systematically murdered in what is known as the Holocaust. Millions more Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, Roma, disabled people, homosexuals, and political opponents had also perished in concentration and extermination camps. The war itself had killed tens of millions more, both combatants and civilians, and the consequences did not end with the defeat of Germany. The division of Europe into Western and Soviet spheres of influence, agreed at Yalta and Potsdam, led directly to the Cold War that would dominate world politics for the next 4 decades. The division of Germany into 2 separate states, which would not reunify until 1990, was another direct consequence of the war initiated by Hitler, and the psychological trauma of the war and the Holocaust continues affecting European societies to this day. What lessons can we extract from this history? It is a question posed innumerable times, since 1945, and answers vary depending on who formulates it. Some emphasize the importance of strong democratic institutions that can resist the rise of authoritarian demagogues. The Weimar Republic, with its flawed constitution and weak institutions, was incapable of containing the Nazi movement once it gained popular support. Modern political systems, they argue, must be designed to prevent extremist minorities from taking power, even when they exploit democratic rules. Others underline the danger of extreme ideology, especially when combined with nationalism and racism. Nazism did not emerge from nothing. It was the product of currents of thought that had existed in Europe for centuries, taken to their logical conclusion more extreme. Combating these ideologies requires constant vigilance and readiness to confront hatred wherever it appears. And still others point to individual responsibility. Nazi crimes were not committed solely by a small group of fanatics. They required the active or passive participation of millions of ordinary people. The bureaucrats who processed deportation documents, the train drivers who drove trains to the camps, the neighbours who denounced hidden Jews, all contributed to the machinery of death. Recognising this distributed responsibility is essential to understand how such atrocities can happen and how to prevent them. The last 365 days of Adolf Hitler were ultimately the culmination of everything that had come before. They were days of increasingly desperate and disconnected decisions. They were days of incalculable suffering for millions of people, both victims of the regime and Germans trapped in its collapse. And they were days that marked the end of an era, the closing of a dark chapter of history that must never be forgotten nor repeated. But there are aspects of this history that merit an even deeper exploration. What was happening in the concentration camps during these final months? How did prisoners experience the arrival of liberation? And what did the camps reveal about the true nature of the Nazi regime? The death marches, as they are known today, were one of the most brutal chapters of the final months of the Third Reich. As the Red Army approached concentration camps in Poland and Eastern Germany, Nazi authorities faced a decision: what to do with the prisoners. The most humane option would have been simply to abandon the camps and allow the Soviets to liberate the prisoners. But this would have meant leaving live witnesses to Nazi crimes, something Himmler and other leaders wanted to avoid at all costs. It would also have deprived Germany of a slave labour force still considered valuable for the war effort. The solution they adopted was to evacuate the camps, forcing prisoners to march west toward camps in the interior of Germany. These marches carried out in full winter, without adequate provisions, and under the brutal vigilance of guards who received orders to kill anyone who could not maintain the pace, resulted in the death of tens of thousands of people. Testimonies of survivors paint pictures of almost unimaginable suffering. Prisoners already weakened by years of malnutrition and forced labour were obliged to walk for days without food or water. Those who fell were shot on the spot or abandoned to die of cold. Corpses accumulated along march routes, leaving a macabre trail that liberators would find weeks later. Auschwitz, the largest and most notorious of the extermination camps, was evacuated in mid-January of 1945. When the Red Army was a few kilometres away, approximately 60,000 prisoners were forced to march west in what is known as the Auschwitz Death March. It is estimated that 15,000 of them died during the march, or in transit camps to which they were transferred. When the Soviets finally arrived at Auschwitz on the 27th of January, they found only about 7,000 prisoners, most too sick or weak to have been evacuated. They also found physical proofs of extermination: mountains of shoes, eyeglasses, suitcases, and human hair that had been collected for industrial use. And they found crematoria and gas chambers that Nazis had not had time to destroy completely. The 27th of January is commemorated today as International Holocaust Remembrance Day, an annual reminder of crimes committed and the obligation to ensure they never repeat. But Auschwitz was not the only camp liberated in those final months. As Allies advanced from all directions, they discovered camp after camp, each with its own particular horrors. Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany was liberated by the British on the 15th of April of 1945. What they found there shocked even soldiers hardened by years of combat. The camp was so overcrowded, with prisoners evacuated from other camps accumulating faster than facilities could accommodate, that conditions had collapsed completely. The dead lay unburied next to the living. Typhus and other diseases spread uncontrolled. Approximately 13,000 corpses were found unburied when the British arrived. Images of Bergen-Belsen, filmed and photographed by military documentation teams, were among the first to show the Western world the reality of Nazi camps. They were distributed widely in cinemas and newspapers, provoking horror and disbelief. Many spectators simply refused to believe such atrocities could have happened in modern Europe. Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp, established in 1933, was liberated by Americans on the 29th of April, one day before Hitler's death. Scenes found there provoked a reaction that has been a subject of historical controversy. Some American soldiers, horrified by what they saw, summarily executed SS guards who had surrendered. Exact figures are disputed, but it is believed between 30 and 50 guards were killed in this manner. Was this a war crime, or an understandable reaction to atrocity? Historians and moral philosophers have debated this question for decades. What is indisputable is that the liberation of the camps transformed the understanding of the world about what Nazis had done, taking abstract crimes reported during the war to concrete and undeniable reality. But for liberated prisoners, suffering did not end with the arrival of the Allies. Many were so debilitated by malnutrition and diseases that they died in days and weeks following liberation, despite medical teams' efforts. Their bodies, accustomed to starvation, could not process normal food liberators provided. Thousands died from what is known as refeeding syndrome, a cruel irony after having survived so long. Those who did survive faced new challenges. Where would they go? For many Jews, returning to countries of origin was impossible or undesirable. Their communities had been destroyed. Their properties had been confiscated or destroyed. And anti-Semitism persisted even after Nazi defeat. There were pogroms against Jews trying to return to Poland as late as 1946. Many survivors spent years in displaced persons camps, waiting for the opportunity to emigrate to Palestine, the United States, or other countries. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 finally offered a destination for many of them, although the situation in the new nation was also precarious and dangerous. Trauma from the camps accompanied survivors for the rest of their lives. Many suffered what we would recognize today as post-traumatic stress disorder, though at that time the concept barely existed. Nightmares, flashbacks, survivors' guilt, and difficulty reintegrating into normal life affected generations. And in many cases, trauma was transmitted to children and grandchildren, creating intergenerational effects researchers still study today. What drove Nazis to continue murders until the last possible moment? This is another question that has fascinated historians. Even when defeat was inevitable, when resources were desperately scarce, when every train and every soldier was needed for defense, Nazis continued allocating resources to the extermination of Jews and other groups. Some explanations emphasize ideology. For the most fanatical Nazis, extermination of Jews was not a means to an end, but the end itself. It was the movement's raison d'etre, the sacred mission justifying everything else. Abandoning this mission, even faced with defeat, would have meant admitting all Nazi ideology was erroneous. Other explanations point to more practical factors. The camp system involved hundreds of thousands of people, from guards to administrators to workers in industries using slave labour. This bureaucracy had its own inertia. It kept functioning because it was what it knew how to do, because stopping would have required decisions and efforts no one was willing to make. And other explanations point to the desire to eliminate witnesses. Nazi leaders knew they would be judged for their crimes if they lost the war. Eliminating as many victims and witnesses as possible was a way to reduce evidence available for future accusers. Probably, all these explanations contained some truth. Extermination continued until the end through a combination of ideological fanaticism, bureaucratic inertia, and criminal calculation. It was the final manifestation of a system that had lost all contact with basic humanity. Now, let us consider another dimension of these final months, often overlooked, the experience of ordinary German soldiers who fought to the end. Why did they keep fighting? This is a question that has intrigued military historians for decades. By mid-1945, any rational German soldier could see the war was lost. Continuing to fight only prolonged suffering and increased probabilities of dying. And yet, the German army did not disintegrate as other defeated armies had throughout history. Answers are multiple and complex. For some soldiers, loyalty to the small group, to comrades with whom they had served for years, was more powerful than any strategic consideration. Abandoning companions was unthinkable, even when the cause for which they fought had become absurd. For others, fear was the determining factor. The Nazi regime had executed more than 15,000 German soldiers for desertion or cowardice during the war, more than any other modern army. In the final months, as discipline crumbled, summary executions became even more common. SS patrols roamed lines, shooting anyone showing signs of surrender or unauthorized retreat. For others still, fear of what awaited them if captured by Soviets was sufficient motivation to keep fighting. Stories of Soviet atrocities against prisoners and German civilians, though exaggerated by propaganda, had sufficient basis in reality to inspire genuine terror. Many German soldiers believed, with some justification, that death in combat was preferable to capture by the Red Army. And finally, for some, ideology remained a factor. Decades of Nazi indoctrination have created a generation of young men who genuinely believed in the superiority of the German race and the justice of their cause. These fanatics fought to the end not because they had no choice, but because they believed it was the right thing. The combination of these factors explains why the German army continued resisting, even when resistance was clearly futile. It also explains enormous losses of the war's final months, when hundreds of thousands of German soldiers died, defending positions that had no strategic value. But there were also many German soldiers who chose not to keep fighting. Desertions increased dramatically in final months, though exact figures are difficult to establish. Entire units surrendered en masse to Western allies, taking advantage of any opportunity to escape the fight. And many soldiers simply disappeared, blending in with civilian population and waiting for the chaos of collapse to protect them from consequences. The experience of these ordinary soldiers, both those who fought to the end and those who chose to abandon, is an essential part of the history of the last days of the Third Reich. It reminds us that behind great decisions of leaders and statistics of battles, there were millions of individuals making their own decisions about how to act in impossible circumstances. And what was happening with the German civilian population during these final months? Their experience was one of almost unimaginable suffering, trapped between approaching front violence, Allied bombings continuing without pause, and increasingly irrational demands of a regime refusing to accept defeat. German cities had been bombed for years, but in final months, the air campaign reached maximum intensity. With the Luftwaffe practically destroyed, Allied bombers could operate almost without opposition. Cities that had survived relatively intact during early war years were now reduced to rubble. Dresden, Würzburg, Pforzheim, and dozens of other cities were devastated in enemy attacks, killing tens of thousands of civilians. Military justification for many of these bombings was questionable. By this point in the war, German industrial capacity was effectively destroyed, and attacks served mainly to demoralize population and demonstrate Allied power. Civilians surviving bombings faced other challenges. Food was increasingly scarce as distribution system collapsed. Heating fuel was practically non-existent, forcing families to burn furniture and books to stay warm during brutal winter of 1945. Medical services had crumbled, with hospitals destroyed and medicines exhausted. And for women, especially in zones falling under Soviet control, there existed an additional danger we have already mentioned. Massive rapes accompanying Red Army advance left scars that would take generations to heal, if they ever healed completely. Nazi propaganda tried to use this suffering to galvanize population. Horrors Soviets were committing were presented as proof surrender was unacceptable, that the only option was to fight to the end. But for the majority of civilians, the message had lost all credibility. They only wanted the nightmare to end, no matter how. In final weeks, many German civilians took desperate decisions. Some fled west in massive waves, abandoning everything they owned to escape Soviet advance. Others hid in basements and shelters, waiting for battle to pass over them. And some, especially those who had been most committed to Nazi regime, chose suicide rather than face consequences of defeat. Suicide rates in Germany reached unprecedented levels in April and May of 1945. In some cities, like Demmin in the northeast, massive suicides eliminated significant percentages of population. Reasons were varied: fear of Soviets, shame for defeat, impossibility of imagining life after Nazism, or simply absolute despair. These massive suicides are an aspect of Third Reich fall often overlooked. They reveal extent to which Nazi ideology had corrupted minds of its followers, convincing them death was preferable to a world without Führer. They also reveal failure of regime to provide any preparation for defeat, having insisted until last moment victory was inevitable. But while some chose death, many more chose life. Resilience of German civilians during these final months, their capacity to continue functioning in circumstances of chaos and destruction is notable. Mothers continued feeding children with little they could find. Neighbours helped each other dig shelters from rubble. Communities improvised solutions to problems that would have seemed insoluble in normal times. This resilience would be the base upon which Germany eventually rebuilt itself. The generation that lived horrors of Reich's final months would also be the one working to create a new Germany from ruins of the old. It was an extraordinary transformation from an aggressor and genocidal nation to a peaceful and prosperous democracy, and it occurred in a surprisingly short period of time. But that transformation is another history, for another moment. For now, let us concentrate on the final days of the regime that had to end for the new Germany to be born. The 1st of May of 1945, one day after Hitler's death, the bunker was scene of another tragedy. As we mentioned before, Magda Goebbels murdered her 6 children before committing suicide with her husband. But there were other smaller dramas occurring that same day. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, who had exercised enormous power in regime's final years, tried to escape bunker that night. Together with other officers and officials, he formed part of a group attempting to cross Soviet lines and reach territory controlled by Western allies. Attempt ended in disaster. Bormann died at some point in the night, though exact circumstances of his death were not confirmed until decades later, when his remains were identified by DNA analysis. Other bunker inhabitants took different decisions. Some managed to surrender to Soviets and survived war, though many spent years in prisoner camps in Soviet Union. Others were summarily executed by captors, and others simply disappeared in chaos, their fate never confirmed. Bunker itself became object of intense Soviet interest. Smersh investigation teams, Soviet counterintelligence service, examined it minutely in search of evidence and documents. It was there they found partially burned remains of Hitler and Eva Braun, which were subjected to forensic analysis to confirm their identities. For decades, Soviet government kept secret information about fate of Hitler's remains. Stalin apparently enjoyed ambiguity, permitting Soviet propaganda to suggest Hitler might have escaped, perhaps with Western help. It was only after Soviet Union collapse that files were opened and truth confirmed. Hitler's remains were finally destroyed completely in 1970, when Soviet authorities exhumed them from secret burial place in Magdeburg, incinerated them completely, and scattered ashes in a river. Intention was to ensure no place of pilgrimage existed for followers of extremist ideologies. But stop a moment and consider this. What would have happened if Hitler had chosen to flee instead of staying in Berlin? What would have happened if, instead of committing suicide in that concrete bunker, he had escaped to Bavarian Alps, as so many of his collaborators begged him to do? This question has fascinated historians and fiction writers for decades, and although we will never know for certain what would have happened, we can explore possibilities based on what we know about military and political situation of those final days. The so-called Alpine National Redoubt was a fantasy Nazis had cultivated for months. Idea was remaining German forces would retreat to mountains of Austria and Bavaria, where terrain would favour defenders and where they could resist indefinitely. Weapon and supply depots had supposedly accumulated in region. Fortifications had been built in mountain passes, and Nazi leadership could continue directing resistance from this impregnable bastion. In reality, National Redoubt was little more than propaganda. Supply depots were scarce, fortifications were inadequate, and forces available to defend it were a fraction of what would have been necessary. Allies, who initially had taken threat of Redoubt seriously, soon discovered it was largely an illusion. If Hitler had fled south, he probably would have been captured in a matter of weeks. US forces advanced rapidly through Bavaria and Austria, and there was no organised defence that could stop them. Dictator who had dreamed of conquering world would have ended his days as prisoner, probably facing trial at Nuremberg along with his collaborators. Would this have been better or worse than suicide in bunker? From perspective of justice, a public trial of Hitler would have provided opportunity to document exhaustively his crimes and establish his personal responsibility in incontrovertible manner. It would have denied neo-Nazis possibility of building myths about a heroic death, and it would have given victims and their families a measure of closure that suicide denied them. But it would also have posed enormous challenges. How to process someone responsible for crimes of such magnitude? What punishment could be proportional to murder of millions? And there existed risk trial would provide Hitler a platform to propagate his ideology one last time, converting judicial process into propaganda spectacle. Hitler, of course, never considered seriously possibility of being captured alive. His decision to stay in Berlin and commit suicide was ultimately coherent with his vision of world. For him, life without power was not worth living. Idea of being exhibited as war trophy, of being judged by those he considered inferior, was intolerable. He preferred death on his own terms to any other alternative. But let us return to bunker, and details of those final days historical sources reveal with chilling precision. 16th of January of 1945, Hitler descended to Führerbunker and would never see sun again significantly. This subterranean labyrinth, located approximately 8 meters underground and protected by concrete walls, almost 4 meters thick, would become his living tomb for following 105 days. Bunker contained approximately 30 rooms, distributed on 2 separated levels. One of these rooms was map room or situation room, where Hitler tried to control a war already lost. Here, he met with his generals at least once a day, leaning over maps of Berlin in claustrophobic conditions, tracing impossible plans, directing units no longer existing, issuing orders to generals who no longer believed war could be won. Can you imagine scene? A dictator who had controlled a continent, now reduced to 250 square meters of concrete, surrounded by a small group of fanatics and loyalists, completely disconnected from reality unfolding above his head. Sounds of Soviet artillery penetrating thick walls as constant reminder end was approaching. For 16th of April of 1945, 500,000 Soviet soldiers had gathered at Oder River, with objective of capturing Reich capital. Encirclement tightened inexorably, and Hitler, in his subterranean refuge, continued moving phantom divisions on his maps, convinced some miracle would save him. 20th of April marked his 56th birthday. That day, Berlin was bombarded by Soviet artillery for first time. It was a macabre gift presaging what was to come. Next day, Red Army tanks reached outskirts of city. Ring was closing. What was passing through Hitler's mind in those moments? Testimonies of those who were with him paint picture of accelerated deterioration. His arm trembled uncontrolled. His face was swollen and greyish. His eyes, once described as hypnotic, now seemed dull, lost somewhere between reality and fantasy. 21st of April arrived definitive crisis. Hitler had ordered special counterattack commanded by SS General Felix Steiner. This attack, in Führer's mind, would relieve pressure on Berlin and change course of battle. It was his last hope of military victory. But when conference on situation of following day arrived and Hitler asked about state of Steiner's counterattack, he received devastating news. Orders had not been fulfilled because Steiner simply did not count on necessary forces to execute them. What happened then was witnessed by all present in conference room. Hitler suffered complete nervous collapse, launched diatribe against his generals, calling them traitors and incompetents, and then, for first time, declared war was lost. It was only meeting in which Hitler ordered all young officers and aides to leave room. Never had happened before. Only ones remaining were Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, and Bormann, and before them, dictator who had promised Reich 1,000 years admitted his defeat. Pronouncing those words was like signing his own death sentence, one witness would recall. But it also meant something more. People around him were suddenly released to go. Everyone could leave now, perhaps towards Berchtesgaden. Everyone looked for an exit. Hitler announced he would stay in Berlin until end and then shoot himself. That same day, he asked SS Dr. Werner Haase about most reliable method of suicide. Haase suggested pistol and poison method, combined dose of cyanide, with gunshot to head. But while Hitler contemplated his own death, political dramas continued unfolding around him. Hermann Göring, Luftwaffe commander and second in command of Reich, had moved to Berchtesgaden. When he learned of Hitler's admission of defeat and intention to commit suicide, he sent telegram asking if he should assume leadership of Reich, in accordance with decree of 1941, naming him successor. News of telegrams spread like fire throughout bunker. Soldiers had nothing to do, of course, so any news spread immediately. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary, convinced Führer Göring's letter was an attempt to overthrow him. In response, Hitler informed Göring he would be executed unless he renounced all his positions. Before dawn of 25th of April, Göring was under arrest. Can you perceive irony? Nazi regime, having conquered half Europe, now crumbled in internecine struggles, while enemy approached gates. Those who had sworn eternal loyalty betrayed each other in desperate race to survive. 26th of April. Soviet artillery fire made first direct impacts on Chancellery buildings above Führer bunker. That night, small plane transporting test pilot Hanna Reich and Luftwaffe General Ritter von Greim landed on street near bunker after daring flight during which Greim was wounded in foot by Soviet ground fire. Once inside Führer bunker, wounded Greim was informed by Hitler he had been named new Luftwaffe commander, replacing traitor Göring. It was absurd appointment. Greim was bedridden by his wound, and Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as effective combat force. But Hitler continued playing power games even while everything collapsed. Night of 27th of April. Soviet bombardment of Chancellery buildings reached maximum point with numerous direct impacts. Hitler sent frantic telegrams to Keitel, demanding Berlin be relieved by armies that no longer existed. And then arrived final blow. 28th of April, Hitler received news via Goebbels' propaganda ministry. The British news services reported Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler had sought negotiations with Allies and offered to surrender German armies in West. According to witnesses in bunker, Hitler raged like a madman, with ferocity never before seen. Himmler had been with Hitler since first days of movement, was most loyal executor of his most atrocious policies, and now he had betrayed him. Hitler ordered Himmler's arrest and commanded SS Lieutenant General Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's representative at Hitler's headquarters and also husband of Eva Braun's sister, be taken to Chancellery Garden above bunker and shot. Fegelein was executed that same night. His body remained in garden while Soviet shells fell around. Now, with defections of Göring and Himmler and Soviets advancing deeply into Berlin, Hitler began preparing for his own death. Late in night of 28th, he dictated his last will and political testament in 2 parts. In these documents, far from omitting any responsibility for disasters he had caused, he blamed war exclusively on Jews and international clique, supposedly controlling them. It was sick, delusional document, final distillation of poisonous ideology that had guided all his life. Next morning, 29th of April, bunker inhabitants received news of execution of Mussolini and his mistress Claretta Petacci by Italian partisans. Their bodies had been hung upside down at a gas station in Milan and subjected to fury of crowd. One of those interrogated later commented, this would have served to reinforce Hitler's determination that neither he nor Eva Braun faced this fate. Hitler ordered his personnel to prepare for end. One eyewitness noted Hitler's SS bodyguards were destroying his personal documents. Elsewhere, one of doctors received instructions from Hitler to poison Blondie, his German Shepherd dog, and Eva Braun's spaniel. Why kill dogs? For Hitler, it was practical and symbolic question. Practical because he did not want Soviets to capture his pet, and symbolic because even his animals must accompany him in death. Everything that had surrounded him must be destroyed along with him. Shortly before midnight of 29th of April, Hitler married Eva Braun in small civil ceremony in Führer bunker map room. It was strange wedding, celebrated while Soviet shells fell few hundred meters away. Witnesses were Goebbels and Bormann. No music, no flowers, no celebration. Only minor official reading legal formalities, while world burned above them. Eva Braun became Eva Hitler for less than 40 hours. Afternoon of 29th, Hitler went from room to room, shaking hands with everyone except his most immediate staff, speaking few words of encouragement and thanks to each one. Everyone knew what this farewell meant. 30th of April of 1945 dawned with Soviet forces less than 500 meters from Führer bunker. Red Army had reached nearby Potsdamer Platz, and sounds of battle were everywhere. Chancellery had been under continuous Soviet artillery fire since 5 in morning. Hitler began his normal routine that morning in bunker under Reich Chancellery building. 10 days before, he had emerged from bunker into daylight on his birthday. Inspected, with trembling hand, group of children sent to defend city against Red Army, in name of racial superiority philosophy Hitler professed. That was last time he saw sunlight. During morning, Hitler had meeting with General Helmut Weidling, commander of Berlin defense area. Weidling told Hitler garrison probably would run out of ammunition that night and fighting in Berlin inevitably would end within next 24 hours. Asked permission for escape attempt, request he had made unsuccessfully previously. Hitler did not respond immediately. Weidling returned to his headquarters in Bendlerblock. Around 1 in the afternoon, received Hitler's permission to attempt escape that night. Meanwhile, in bunker, Hitler lunched with 2 secretaries and his personal cook. It was silent meal, tense, loaded with knowledge of what would come. After lunch, Hitler and Eva said goodbye to bunker staff members and other occupants, including Bormann, Goebbels, secretaries, and various military officers. Witnesses described how couple went room to room shaking hands in silence. Everyone knew moment had arrived. Eva hugged Secretary Traudl Jungner, and in what seemed to have been her last recorded words, said, "Take my fur coat as remembrance." I always liked well-dressed women." Then saying, "It's over, goodbye," Hitler took Eva back to his rooms for last time. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, Adolf and Eva Hitler entered private study. Hitler's adjutant, SS Sturmbannführer Otto Günscher, stood guard outside study door. Those waiting outside could feel fear climbing inside them, remained there, waiting, without knowing exactly what happened behind that closed door. After some time, Hitler's valet, Heinz Linder, entered antechamber of Hitler's rooms, where he discovered closed door and supposedly smelled gunpowder smoke. Linder left corridor where Bormann was standing, and two entered study together. What they found was final scene of Third Reich drama. Hitler was slumped on sofa, with blood dripping from gunshot to his right temple. Eva Braun had died from ingesting poison. Linder declared later that while he was in room, he noticed immediately smell of burnt almonds, common observation in presence of hydrogen cyanide. It was approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. Dictator who had dreamed of dominating world lay dead on bloodstained sofa in subterranean bunker, while armies he had promised to defeat advanced on his capital. Günch left study and announced Hitler was dead to group in conference room, including Goebbels and Generals Hans Krebs and Wilhelm Burgdorf. These three, plus others, including Hitler Youth leader Arthur Axmann, saw bodies. What followed was improvised cremation reflecting chaos of those last moments. Linder and another individual wrapped Hitler's body in blanket. Then, according to Hitler's previous written and verbal instructions, his body and Braun's were carried upstairs through bunker emergency exit to garden behind Reich Chancellery, where they were to be burned with gasoline. Hitler's driver helped carry Eva's body part of way, and noted that once there it was placed on ground next to Hitler. Said to his interrogators he had noticed she wore blue summer dress made of real silk, that her shoes had cork heels, and her hair was artificially blonde. Moments later, same witness saw group including Goebbels and Bormann gathered next to bodies. One of them poured gasoline from can over bodies, then withdrew to safety of door with sound of Russian artillery all around. Hitler's adjutant lit gasoline-soaked rag and threw it over bodies, which immediately burst into flames. Group gave Nazi salute and withdrew. First attempts to light gasoline did not work. Linder returned inside bunker and returned with thick roll of papers to help start fire. Bunker telephone operator, SS Oberscharführer Rochus Misch, reported Hitler's death to Führer Escort Command Chief Franz Schadler, and returned to switchboard, recalling later someone shouting Hitler's body was being burned. During next hours, bodies were sprayed repeatedly with gasoline. Red Army bombarded area inside and around Reich Chancellery intermittently throughout afternoon. SS guards brought additional gasoline cans to keep burning corpses. Although bodies were being burned in open air, where heat distribution varies unlike crematorium, according to eyewitnesses, copious amount of fuel applied from approximately 4 until 6:30. In afternoon reduced remains to something between charred bones and piles of ash that crumbled to touch. Approximately at 6:30, ashen remains were covered in a shallow bomb crater. Bombardment and napalm incendiary bonfire continued until 2nd of May. During this period, it was difficult to spend time in garden due to continuous bombardment. Around 4:15, Linder ordered carpet in Hitler's study rolled up to burn it. One of those in charge declared later that upon entering study, he saw a pool of blood size of large dinner plate next to sofa armrest. Noticing spent cartridge casing, bent down and picked it up from where it lay on carpet approximately 1 meter from 7.65 pistol. 2 removed bloodstained carpet and carried it upstairs to Chancellery Garden, where it was placed on ground and burned. Thus ended Adolf Hitler. Not in glory he had always imagined, but in improvised flames in bombarded garden, while his enemies approached. But Führer's death did not end drama in bunker. In fact, in many ways, final act barely began. Back inside bunker, with Führer disappeared, everyone began to smoke, practice Hitler generally had prohibited in his presence. It was a small act of freedom after years of restrictions. Then began collectively planning bold but unsuccessful escapes from Berlin to avoid capture by Soviets. General Krebs met with Soviet General Vasily Chuikov just before 4 in the morning of 1st of May, giving him news of Hitler's death while trying to negotiate the ceasefire and open peace negotiations. Stalin was informed of Hitler's suicide around 4 to 5, Berlin time, 13 hours after event. Stalin demanded unconditional surrender, which Krebs lacked authorization to give. Soviet leader wanted confirmation Hitler was dead and ordered Red Army Counterintelligence Unit, SMERSH, to find his corpse. Next day, 1st of May, Goebbels and his wife proceeded to poison their 6 small children in bunker. It is one of the most disturbing scenes of entire Third Reich drama. Mother administering sedatives to her own children, then introducing cyanide capsules in their mouths while they slept. Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig and Heidrun, whose ages range from 4 to 12 years, died without knowing what was happening. After murdering their children, Joseph and Magda Goebbels went up to Chancellery Garden, where they were shot in nape at her request by SS officer. Their bodies were then burned, but only partially destroyed and were not buried. Their macabre remains were discovered by Soviets when they took Chancellery. In early hours of morning of 2nd of May, Soviets captured Reich Chancellery. Inside Führer bunker, Krebs and Bergdorf shot themselves in head. Beginning of May, dental remains of Hitler and Braun were extracted from ground. Stalin was wary of believing Hitler was dead and restricted release of information to public. For decades, Soviet government would keep secret exact details of what they had found, fueling conspiracy theories that would persist for generations. But while final drama unfolded in Berlin, rest of Germany also crumbled, and it is here where we must expand our gaze beyond bunker to understand magnitude of total collapse. What happened in rest of Reich while Hitler committed suicide in his subterranean refuge? Answer is absolute chaos. German forces surrendered en masse on all fronts. Entire units abandoned positions and marched west, desperate to surrender to Americans or British, before being captured by Soviets. Civilians fled in massive waves, carrying little they could carry, leaving behind homes inhabited for generations. German cities still not captured were bombarded without mercy. Transport systems had collapsed. Food was desperately scarce. And in midst of this chaos, small groups of Nazi fanatics continued executing anyone showing signs of defeatism or attempting to surrender. Admiral Karl Dönitz, whom Hitler had named successor in political testament, tried for a few days to maintain some form of government. From port city of Flensburg, near Danish border, this phantom government tried to negotiate surrender, permitting as many German troops and civilians as possible to escape Soviet zone. But Allies were not willing to permit any game. 7th of May of 1945, representatives of Dönitz government signed unconditional surrender of all German armed forces at Allied General Headquarters in Reims, France. Next day, to satisfy Soviet demands, ceremony was repeated in Berlin. War in Europe had officially ended. Third Reich, which Hitler had proclaimed would last 1,000 years, had lasted exactly 12 years, 4 months, and 8 days. In that time, had unleashed most destructive war in history, had murdered millions of people in industrialized extermination program, and had reduced large part of Europe to rubble. What was total cost? Figures are almost impossible to understand in their enormity. It is estimated Second World War caused between 70 and 85 million deaths, depending on how counted. This includes approximately 6 million Jews murdered in systematic process we know as Holocaust. Includes millions of Soviet prisoners of war who died in German captivity. Includes civilians of all nationalities who perished in bombings, massacres, and privations of war. Germany itself lost approximately 7 million people both military and civilian. Its cities were devastated, its infrastructure destroyed, its territory divided among victors, and its people marked by collective trauma that would take generations to process. But beyond statistics are individual stories of suffering no number can capture. Families separated never to reunite, children who grew up without parents, camp survivors who would carry experiences forever, cities and communities erased from map as if they never existed. And all this was consequence of decisions of one individual who, during last 365 days of his life, had innumerable opportunities to minimize damage, but chose consistently to maximize it. What does this history teach us? What lessons can we extract from Third Reich collapse that are relevant for our own time? First lesson is about danger of absolute power. Hitler could make catastrophic decisions until end because no institutional mechanism existed that could stop him. Generals who knew his orders were suicidal obeyed them anyway, or were replaced by others who would. Officials who saw madness of his policies kept silent out of fear. System Nazis had built eliminated all safeguards that could have limited damage. Second lesson is about importance of truth. Nazi regime was built on lies. Lies about racial superiority, lies about Jewish conspiracies, lies about military situation. These lies not only deceived German people, eventually deceived Nazi leaders themselves, who lost capacity to evaluate reality with precision. When Hitler moved non-existent divisions on his maps, was not simply lying to others, was lying to himself. Third lesson is about individual responsibility. Nazi crimes were not committed solely by a small group of fanatics. Required participation of millions of ordinary people, soldiers who shot, bureaucrats who processed documents, neighbours who denounced, spectators who did nothing. Each one made decisions, and each decision contributed to final result. And fourth lesson, perhaps most important, is about fragility of civilization. Germany in 20s was one of most educated and culturally advanced societies in world, had universities of world prestige, rich artistic and philosophical tradition, and prosperous middle class, and yet, in less than a decade, transformed into genocidal state capable of worst imaginable atrocities. If this could happen in Germany, can happen anywhere. Eternal vigilance is price of liberty. Last 365 days of Adolf Hitler were ultimately culmination of everything that had come before, were inevitable result of ideology based on hate, political system without checks, and leader whose judgment was fatally compromised, were days of massive destruction, of incalculable suffering, and of madness that cost millions of lives, but also were days that marked end of nightmare, when flames consumed Hitler's remains in Chancery Garden, also consumed symbolically regime he had built. From ashes of Third Reich eventually would arise New Germany, democratic and peaceful, that would become one of pillars of modern Europe. That transformation was not easy nor rapid, required decades of work, of painful reflection on past, and of conscious commitment never to repeat errors that had led to catastrophe. But it happened. In fact, it happened offers perhaps most hopeful lesson of all, that even after worst disasters, reconstruction is possible. Bunker where Hitler spent his last days no longer exists as a recognizable structure. Area was leveled by East German authorities after war, and today is innocuous parking lot near Potsdamer Platz. There are no monuments, no elaborate commemorative plaques, only small informative panel explaining briefly what happened there. This absence of monumentality is deliberate. Unlike memorials to victims of Nazism, which are numerous and prominent in Berlin and throughout Germany, site of Hitler's death was left intentionally unmarked for decades. Intention was to avoid it becoming place of pilgrimage for admirers of dictator, and ensure history remembered victims, not perpetrator. It is decision reflecting mature understanding of how historical memory can be used and abused, and his final reminder that, although we must study figures like Hitler to understand how such disasters occur, we must not glorify them, nor permit their memory to eclipse that of those who suffered for their actions. This was all. If this story made you reflect on dangers of extremism, on importance of protecting democratic institutions, and on responsibility each of us has to resist injustice, then has fulfilled its purpose. History of Third Reich collapse is not only history about past, is warning for future, and depends on every generation ensuring that warning is heard. Until next video.